Hello and welcome to our program Where God Weeps, a program in which we speak with church leaders from around the world to the situation of the Catholic Church, especially in areas where she suffers discrimination or persecution. Archbishop Peter B. Wells is the Apostolic Nuncio to South Africa, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, and Eswatini. Archbishop Wells, a native of Tulsa, Oklahoma, has served in the Vatican's diplomatic service since 1999, and in 2016 was posted to South Africa, where today he serves these 5 countries. The task is not without its challenges. Africa today, especially sub-Saharan Africa, confronts poverty, corruption, violence, and migration. To tell us more about the role and the challenges facing the Church in Africa, it's my privilege to welcome His Excellency Archbishop Wells. Your Excellency, thank you for being with us here today in our program.
Thank you, Mark, for the invitation.
You have served in the Vatican's diplomatic service since 1999, but as an American from Oklahoma, what was your first thought when you got the posting to come to Africa?
Well, I actually was very excited in many ways. I realized the challenges as I had worked here before. I had been posted in Nigeria from 1999 until 2002.
So it was not unfamiliar to you?
Not unfamiliar, at least Western Africa. I had never been in Southern Africa as we are now, and they're 2 distinct realities in many ways. However, when I was in the Vatican for many years, I worked in a section and I followed African questions. I was kind of the African desk, and I followed Asian questions as well. So I was already aware of many of the concerns that are prevalent here in Southern Africa. So for me, it was a happy surprise, I would say.
What is it to be an Apostolic Nuncio? What does it mean?
Well, a nuncio, you know, is a twofold job in many ways. The first thing is the nuncio. The word itself means one who announces the good news, the gospel. So we are sent by the Holy Father as his legates with a twofold function. The first thing we do is we are accredited to local governments. The Holy See, which is a sovereign entity subject to international law, also has many diplomatic missions. So we have a number of ambassadors throughout the world. I think we have about 102 right now. So I'm accredited as an ambassador, just like any other ambassador of government, from one government to another, to talk about our areas of concern, our areas of mutual agreement, even sometimes our areas of maybe a little disagreement where we think maybe we could do better one party or the other. So that's my first job. My second job is, as a nuncio, you are also sent to the local church to be the Pope's interlocutor between the local church and the Holy See, and especially with His Holiness our Pope. I always like to say that what that entails is we bring to the local church the hopes, the visions, the prayers, the concerns that our Holy Father would have for them locally, and at the same time we take their hopes, their concerns, their challenges back to our Holiness, who at times can help them address on a larger stage what they may be facing on a daily basis.
Would you see your role as more of a brother to the bishops or as a father to the bishops?
I think that I think for all of us today, especially for people in leadership in the Church, we are called to be brother as a bishop. You're also be called to be father as a bishop, but sometimes you're called to be the son as well. We should never think that we can't learn from them as well. And one of the things that I have found, especially from living in Africa for these many years, is that the bishops have a lot to teach me, and they have taught me a lot, but also the lay people and the religious. They also acted as parents to me and told me ways we should go, even chastised me at times, but that's all good. I think that's a way of forming better leaders in the Church.
Your Excellency, you come from an American background, an American cultural upbringing in the American Catholic faith. How would you describe, and what was it that you appreciate, or what is it that you appreciate in the African faith?
You cannot help but come to Africa and be, in a sense, a bit overwhelmed by the enthusiasm of the faith here. And also the youth. of the church. I mean, yesterday we were in a crowd of about 4,000 to 5,000 people, and it was filled with young people.
Yeah, it was amazing.
This
amazing.
is something we don't often see in the Western world anymore, but you certainly see it here. And because of that, I think that's part of where the enthusiasm comes for. And there's also a huge thirst to be part of the church, to understand why the church teaches what it teaches, to engage the church. People here still, when they go to Mass on Sunday, they may spend the entire day there. This is kind of the highlight of their week. So we have a lot to learn from what Africa has done and is doing vis-a-vis the faith. And also that they never take it for granted. There's never taking their faith for granted. And it permeates every level of their life. They have no problem with talking to anybody about their faith.
I want to stay a little bit with the question of faith. Would you say that the faith in Africa is still like a fire?
You have to realize that, I mean, the faith has only been on the continent near a couple of centuries, really, for all practical purposes, even though there were missionaries in the 1600s, but it was never really firmly rooted. So you really have, over the last 200 years, a real explosion of the faith in Africa. So as in any first experience of Christianity, as we saw throughout our early history in Christianity, they're suffering from the same problems. They also have the same zeal that you often see. We also have the Pentecostals here, which are rapidly expanding, who have a much more emotional view of religion than maybe you would in the more institutional churches. What I do see, though, is that there has been an interesting balance in Africa, where you are seeing ever more the institutional church, the intellectual tradition of the church very much rooted. You see a very good education or developing education among our seminarians and priests. At the same time, they have not lost the enthusiasm. The enthusiasm is still there.
Your Excellency, I want to turn now to some of the challenges that we see very evidently in Africa. And it strikes me that Africa is one of the richest continents on the planet in terms of natural resources, and yet most Africans don't see the benefit of these riches. In fact, the economy seems unable to leave this position of extraction, transport, and sale of raw materials. Is the African economy trapped?
It's very worrying what is going on right now, and I see it in this way. Unfortunately, I think the very negative effects of the colonialism, which is still very prevalent in the African continent, and what is still present there, and it has created an idea that Africa is still a commodity. It's not a partner. And as long as there's this idea that an entire continent or groups of people are a commodity, you're going to have exploitation. You're going to have the problems that we see going on every day. And it's going to be very difficult to exit this. What we need is on the part of the international community a much larger engagement with Africa, seeing them as partners, and that they have much to offer, not only in resources, but also human resources, intellectual resources. I mean, the people here are extremely talented. They have a type of wisdom, too, that they can offer to us that we don't often see in our own cultures anymore. They also have certain values, respect for the elderly, things that we have maybe taken for granted or let fall aside. And I think we have to be very cognizant of that and listen. We have to take a posture of listening with Africa. Instead of telling them what to do, maybe we need to listen to them. Another point that I would like to make regarding this idea of commodity is that we do have, and colonialism in particular, we still have a problem with colonialism, and Pope Francis has spoken to this many times. We have an ideological colonialism which is going on right now.
How do you mean?
And this is where certain countries come in, or even institutions come in, and if you do not accept certain ideologies, then they will restrict certain assistance. And this is a very big problem.
Binding food aid, for example,
to certain positions of the international community, ideological positions. So we have to be very careful about ideological colonialism, because they should also have the ability as people and as countries and as nations
to determine
what is important for them and the values that they want to continue to hold.
I want to touch a number of issues, so I'm hoping we have enough time to get through all of these. But there is, as we've spoken, economic, but there's also social and political issues, particularly corruption, youth frustration, and finally violence, all which result in poverty and displacement. I'd like to start first with corruption. Why is there such a climate of corruption which seems endemic throughout all of Africa?
First of all, my reaction to that would be corruption's everywhere. We have lots of corruption in the West. We may call it different things, but we have a lot of corruption. I think sometimes there is an imbalance of concentration on corruption in Africa. And I think maybe sometimes it's unfair.
How do you mean?
I think because I think there is a reaction on the part of the West sometimes because of what we see here, that we fail to look at the log in our own eye because of the splinter in our brother's eye. So I think we'd be careful about that.
Okay.
There are huge problems with corruption here, absolutely. A lot of it I sometimes think is related to the framework of governmental systems here, where you have a parliamentary system where parties stay in power for many, many, many years. And as we all know, that when you have that kind of a situation, at times that can lead to corruption. There's also a lot of money involved with the type of resources that we're dealing with here. And I think there have been what I would say immoral practices in business where they tempt people to become corrupt in order for a payoff, in order to have rights for extraction, et cetera. So this is also something that has to be dealt with. It's a far more complicated problem, I see, than just looking at one particular country or one particular continent. There are safeguards we can put into place, but it takes years to build up this ethic and this idea of what it means for transparency, what it means for good governance, et cetera. One of the things I think is very important is to I see this happening in 4 areas particularly. First of all, I think you have to be very careful about making sure that institutions are strong. The parliament, the executive, the judiciary must be strong
and
institution. That's the second point. Separation of powers is very, very important, as we all know. The third part is free and fair elections is also very, very important for the future. And then the fourth and final, I think, is to make sure that people are properly trained with the ethic of service and not of what can I gain by this particular position. We find this everywhere. But that is, the idea of service is something that really needs to be fostered, I think, throughout all societies, and in particular even here. So.
Your Excellency, I want to move now to a consequence of the corruption, and that is youth frustration. We see that in Africa, the population bulge at the moment, the greatest group is approximately 19 years old, which is on one side a huge human potential. But at the same time, if this potential is not realized, it leads to an enormous frustration. And I think that's what we're seeing today. Can you tell us how you see this problem?
The problem here fundamentally is unemployment. As you're probably aware, in my region, in fact, the region in which I deal, we have the highest unemployment in the world right now. The official is about 30-something% of unemployment. However, with young people 35 and below, it's as high as 50% in some areas. So when that continues, even for generations, or certainly for decades, the level of frustration increases tremendously. And also there becomes a certain reticence to even try to engage oneself because you feel like it will do nothing. This is a huge problem in the region. Another problem, of course, is the education system. They're constantly working in the area to improve education, to make sure children are going to school. But one has to ask something. If you're a 14-year-old young man, a young woman, and you see that your entire family has no work anyhow, what's the impetus to go to school? We unfortunately put school together with getting a job, even though, as we know, education is far more important than just work. But still, in their mindset, it's, well, why should I do this? I won't be able to get work anyhow. This frustration, of course, leads to all sorts of behavioral problems.
Social ills.
Yes, drugs and alcohol is a huge problem. We have problems with, the sex trafficking. People fall into that oftentimes because they can find nothing else. You have criminality at all levels, which has become a big problem. In fact, there's a new statistic that came out today, which is saying that South Africa is the 19th most penetrated country in the world by organized crime right now. A lot of that would be from the fact that people they feel they have no other options. They're very likely to turn to these type of things. It also causes all sorts of social unrest, like we said. We had, in South Africa a year ago, July, we had huge violent protests, terrible protests. We've never seen anything quite like it. A lot of that is caused by political turmoil. A lot of it was caused the post-COVID-19 situation, but a lot of it caused just a frustration among people because they don't see that they have, that their potentials are being recognized or realized, but also that they don't see a lot of chances for the future. So it is leading to social unrest. And we've always had a tradition of toy-toying, as they call it here in Southern Africa, where they do these type of protests, but it seems to have become more violent in recent times. We have a situation where we have groups that are very anti-migration that are rising up because there is a tendency to try to blame migrant peoples when you have problems finding employment among your own people.
It's almost a xenophobia.
Yeah, it is a xenophobia. Xenophobia is a big problem in the region, and scapegoating. And what do you scapegoat? You scapegoat another ethnic group.
I'd like to come back to the question of migration a little bit later, but at the moment, I'd like to also consider how the terrain is being prepared for what we see as this criminality, but also criminality which has been ideologically manipulated by certain fundamentalist and extremist groups. I'm speaking notably about ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Shabaab in Mozambique. We see, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, the spread of what some would call jihadist banditry, that is this mix of criminality with religion. And the young person who is frustrated with the government, frustrated with corruption, frustrated with his own environment, along comes an armed group and says, I'll give you a gun, I'll give you money, and I'll even give you a motivation, a religious motivation or an ideological motivation to go and kill. Mm-hmm. How do you see this, this new problem which has been in the last 20 years, but coming now, I think, to a real problem for Africa, which is this Islamic extremism and jihadist banditry?
Yes, I think that you're correct. It's very hard for us to know where thuggery ends and extremism begins. They are very much related. And there are certain groups who are exploiting the situation with our young people especially, and offering certain benefits, etc., if they will join in their brigade. And unfortunately, it's a vicious circle, and it's hard to know how this is going to play out. One of the things that I also worry about, and something that we're seeing, whether it be with, for instance, xenophobic groups who are going after and attacking other groups, or whether it be religious extremism that's attacking, is that you're seeing radicalization happening on the other side now. So what we're seeing now is, especially within some communities, even Christian radicalization, where the Christians themselves are taking matters into their own hands.
Vigilantes.
Vigilantism, just out of anger, vendetta, and they're going after Muslim groups or other groups. And it is once again, it's this vicious circle.
In many cases, Muslims are equally as victims as the Christians are,
yes.
Particularly those, for example, we see in Mozambique, where the Al-Shabaab attack, and if the Muslim doesn't agree with the Islamist ideology, he too will be beheaded.
Yes.
So in many ways the Muslims are equally
in some
victims.
places even more so. In some places, statistically, it's the Muslim communities which are more affected by this type of radicalization and violence than the non-Muslim communities.
I'd like to then come to what we spoke about briefly, because this impacts migration. The UNHCR estimates that approximately 30 million people are internally displaced in Africa today. What do we understand by migration? We've touched on one of them, which is the issue of violence, which is chasing people from their villages. But what are the other drivers of migration today?
The displacement here happens for any number of issues. I think one of the things is, first of all, principally it's economic reasons. You see a large movement, particularly of mothers and children, to try to find a way of making a living, a better way of life. A lot of what we see coming into this part of Africa, in fact, the migration that's taking place within it is because of a lack of any kind of hope to find any kind of sustenance in your area, and they come in. The other one is because of environmental factors. We have been, in this part of Africa, we've had terrible problems with drought for a number of years. Just recently, we've had El Niño, which has caused enormous rains. So especially those who are sustenance farmers, for instance, they can no longer, they've had years where they had no crops, then all of a sudden they got crops and they couldn't get in the fields to get them, and they rotted in the fields. So this is pushing these peoples into places where they can try to find a better living. Unfortunately, it's kind of a false hope, because a lot of times they think they can find work, for instance, in South Africa, but when they get there, they realize the situation there is the same as it was at home. And this is very frustrating and problematic for them. Another problem we have here with migration trends has to do with elections. As you know, a lot of times during the election periods, it can cause a lot of violence. People become worried and concerned, and so they will move about during those periods of times as well.
And I think another factor which we've spoken about earlier is the question of man-made famine. I think we are looking at situations where the violence is pushing the farmers, agriculturalists off their land. They're going into refugee or IDP camps. How important or how big is the concern of man-made famine for Africa today?
It's the worst it's been probably since World War II, I would say right now. We had a perfect storm. We already had a problem, especially with drought, for a long period of time before the pandemic. Then the pandemic hit. Huge amounts of people lost work, but also mobility. People could not move around. One thing that a lot of people don't realize, especially in our part of the world, is how dependent young children are for school meals here. This may be their only meal in a day. When you close down schools, you close down feeding programs. So we had a real increase in child famine among children. Food insecurity has become more and more disconcerting now with the fact that post-pandemic, if you want to say at this point, but we are still facing a problem with food shortages because of supply lines. This has particularly affected areas that are not producing a lot of food themselves, but are very dependent on food coming in. The supply lines have broken down. Then with the war in the European theater right now, it has caused extreme problems with the production of, or at least the exportation of wheat.
And fertilizer.
And fertilizer, but also, you know, corn is very important here. It's one of the most important things. That's their main staple, pop. The majority of these people eat a corn-based staple. And so that has also been difficult to get. And so it has been, we've seen a huge increase. Through Caritas and then even through different programs that are coming in here, we are running more food programs now than ever before in the region. And we are just offering basic supplies, but the numbers have gone up exponentially of people who need help. Case in point, that we used to help out with a soup kitchen, which would feed about 30 people a day. Now they're having about 700 a day that are showing up. So these are problems that, and they don't seem to be waning. They seem to be getting worse.
Do you lose hope? Do you, I mean, these challenges, what we've only covered in now a small half hour, seem so overwhelming. How do you see the role of the Church and faith as an answer, if it's possible?
You know, I mean, first of all, as an institution, I think the Church is doing an extraordinary job in this area. We have just yearly, people don't realize it, but we're pumping in over 100 million a year just into the area, mainly for food programs. And also for social programs, etc. Just as you know, Aid to the Church in Need is one of those who's on the forefront of what's happening. Miserior, you have all of these. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. They're all helping in their own way. That is extremely important. But also on the level of faith, we were talking about the importance of faith to people here, and they do see the impact of prayer, even if they're suffering. They love it when you pray together with them, if you want to pray with them. One of the things I always remember is, I once heard said, is no matter how poor you are, there's always someone a little poor. And you may not be able to have something material to offer, but you can offer them part of yourself. You can offer a kind word, a prayer, a thought, and maybe that's what they need for the day, even more than they need a piece of bread. So we should never forget that, because we always have something to offer. And this is what I see in this society here. We hear a lot the term Ubuntu here. And there's a very Christian dimension to Ubuntu as well. It's a traditional African idea that says, I am because you are. And it is exactly what we think of as in Christianity. The reason I am what I am is because of another, because of the other, mainly Jesus Christ and our Lord. But we are identified in the other. And this is what they see here, is that if you help your brother and sister, you also are helping yourself, because we all increase when others increase. So.
Your Excellency, thank you for having been with us today in our program.
Mark, it was a delight. Thank you so much.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having been with us today in our program, Where God Weeps. And if you'd like to know more about the situation of the Catholic Church in Africa, some of the challenges that it faces, perhaps how you might be able to help, I would encourage you to look at the contact information at the end of this program. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.